Hello. My name is Vincent David. I'm the editor of Spartacist. And today I want to talk about Trump. More precisely, I want to go through the article published by our American comrades. If you don't know them, Workers' Vanguard is the newspaper of the Spartacist League in the US. Where is the US going? Tasks for the workers' movement. And the aim of that quite lengthy piece is to really explain in a materialist way where this Trump comes from. What laid the ground for the Trump's comeback, and what is the root really of the profound shift we're seeing right now in American politics. And to really get a good understanding of what's happening right now, and also to know what to do, you have to understand what's been happening in the US in the last 2 decades and even in the last 30 years. So that's what I want to dive into in this two-part series. And to understand a bit where Trump comes from, you have to go all the way back to 30 years ago. The U.S. led liberal order, so the American empire essentially, was built, of course, after the Second World War, but really built on the ashes of the destruction of the Soviet Union in 1991, 1992. And the fall of the Soviet Union really established the US as the world unquestioned superpower, the biggest military. Really, it was the era of US complete hegemony. Also, what the fall of the Soviet Union represented was the opening of previously untapped market and resources to plunder, whether it was all of Eastern Europe and Russia opened for investment, but also China, which opened up its economy in many ways, started in the 80s, but accelerated in the 90s, opened its economy to foreign investment. And to maximize their advantage, the U.S. imperialist ruler pursued globalization with a vengeance. That was really the basis of globalization, right? The opening of China, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the international dominance of one superpower, the U.S. Um, and the United States offshored their production in multiple other countries, which provided a pool of cheap labor, and they expanded their reach in every corner of the world. NATO, for example, the military alliance dominated by the US, extended its borders from Germany all the way to the east, all the way to the very borders of Russia. And time again, the IMF and the World Bank rewrote the rule of the world order according really to the interests of Wall Street. And the spread of US imperialism tentacles around the world was given an ideological justification and cover with liberalism. Liberalism, liberal democracy, liberal ideas were proclaimed as the pinnacle of human civilization, in the aftermath of the victory of the Cold War. The US and its allies really ruled the world in the name of liberal principles like freedom and democracy, the defense of the defenseless, defense of minorities, the right to protect, the responsibility to protect, sorry, and such mantra really provided a convenient cover to assert U.S. dominance. And the freedom in ideological term really reflected the necessity for U.S. capital to freely expand throughout the world. And really, in this process, also strangle oppressed countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia. And really, in the 90s, 2000, the liberal world order seemed indestructible and really gave a temporary breath of life for imperialism. However, this was temporarily because it could not stop the decay of the U.S. power of the imperialists of imperialism, which really lied beneath that veneer. Because the very forces set in motion by U.S. hegemony and globalization also contain dynamics which were eroding the United States. Unprecedented US capital penetration propelled the growth of world trade, but also the industrialization of other emerging power, for example, the development of China, which went from a fairly agrarian country to a industrial power and the factory of the world, essentially. And really, this process hollowed out what used to be the source of power of the United States, that is, its industrial base, its manufacturing power, which which really faded with offshoring. And it also deepened the social rot in the US as the economy was being more and more centered around finance and Wall Street, and really started to reduce the economic weight of the United States on the globe. And to stabilize their position, and really to shore up the decline of US imperialism, the US rulers must reverse the dynamics which have been dominant in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s as well. But to do so, they have to tear apart the basis of globalization, of free trade by raising tariffs, decoupling with China. They must press neo colonies further. And yeah, they must confront and organize the confrontation with China. And this really underlines the current conflict within the US ruling class and really the conflict we've seen in the last decade. So, the 90s and 2000s were really the golden era of US hegemony and liberal triumph in the Cold War. And the first serious crack that started to appear in this was the 2008 financial crisis. Um, the 2008 crisis provoked a massive economic immiseration among millions, especially Black and Latino families. Many went bankrupt in the face of ballooning subprime mortgage payments or were saddled with a skyrocketing medical debt. Millions of decent paying jobs were wiped out and replaced by low tier gig work and really temporary employment. You have to understand as well that between 2000 and 2017, I believe, the US lost almost 6 million manufacturing jobs with offshoring. And this is a tremendous number if you think that every single one of these jobs was supporting a family, and that also every single one of these jobs was supporting entire communities and towns built around industry, which suddenly, left, really laying waste to entire regions of the United States, where drugs and misery now prevail. In the political arena, the bourgeoisie did what some thought impossible at the time. They put a black man in the White House. Barack Obama was really the living embodiment of liberal principles and ideology from the post Soviet period. And his campaign was premised on hope and change, including to end the deeply unpopular war in Iraq, which was really muddying US's image on the world stage. And it also played up the false notion that electing a black president would show how progressive the US is. And, some people were talking about a post racial society. Um, so putting a black man at the head of US imperialism really cost the ruling class nothing. And it was just the thing to calm the masses and also the bosses before the president engineered the auto and bank bailout on the backs of the working class with taxpayers' money, and at the same time deported millions of immigrants. A ton of anti-workers attacks were passed and also aided by the union leaders. That's where you get the proliferation of tiers and different treatment between newly hired workers and older workers. And the union leaders really accepted this in the name of saving jobs. And Obama's election didn't come about because the bourgeoisie no longer needed the oppression of black people, obviously. Quite the contrary. It was really progressive identity politics corresponded really to what it needed at the time. But the financial meltdown also accelerated trends opposed to the liberal status quo. The economic devastation sowed the seeds of political discontent and the emergence of populism as an alternative, both right wing and left wing as well. Um, and within the ruling class, that's in the year 2010s, a conflict started to emerge over how best to shore up US imperialism, which was obviously declining. And the options were kind of to go full steam ahead with the liberal ideas and liberal institution which had served so well the US in the 90s and the 2000s, or try something else and break with it. And the two main bourgeois parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, struggled internally and with one another to resolve which would be the party of the status quo, double down on the status quo, and which one would be the party to break with it. And in the 2016 Democratic presidential nominee contest, Hillary Clinton was really the face of the party establishment, while Bernie Sanders was the establishment candidate, having been brought to the fore in the post 2008 era of really neoliberal attacks. And Sanders' rhetoric against the billionaire class, its promise of Medicare for all, attracted crowds because it spoke really to felt needs in the American population. And he represented those liberals who thought that the status quo now required some new dressing to really stop the bleeding and shore up the fortunes of the Democratic Party. But this option was really considered by the majority of the liberal establishment as being too radical and too expensive, because why go with Medicare for all, which would cost a fortune and require confronting the huge pharma companies, when you could go down the Obama route again? The first woman president, Hillary Clinton, would cost nothing and earn a lot of progressive points and keep the wheels of liberalism turning for another day. On the other side, in the Republican Party, you really had a showdown between Trump and the party establishment. Trump reflected those in the ruling class who believed that liberalism and liberal institutions and veneer um, was becoming a hindrance on shoring up the U.S. imperialist position. And he had a clear goal to put U.S. capitalism on a different track: right wing populism, protectionism, closing the border. And Trump knew that a section of the class he represented, the rulers obviously, was losing out to rivals like China, and something drastic needed to be done. You could see it even in his behavior, and how he was flouting like liberal norms was a break with everything that had defined the previous period. And the mere possibility that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee really sent shockwave through the Republican establishment and liberals everywhere. Trump was everything they hated because, liberals, they're polished and hypocritical. They're the friend who smiles while stabbing you in the back. And Trump, in contrast, was really the guy who's going to stab you in the front. His rabid insults, his vulgar talk of grab him by the pussy, really ran counter to what liberals stood for, and the sort of veneer that they put of concern for the oppressed, this hypocrisy that they care about the oppressed groups. He was really provoking this. And so the conflict within the ruling class over which way forward spilled over in the 2016 presidential campaign. And that's best captures with the slogans of the two candidates. You had Trump, which was saying, "Make America great again," and Clinton's, whose tone and basically overall campaign was basically saying, "America is already great." But the Clinton loss was not a decisive defeat for the liberal order. In fact, the entire first Trump presidency was a clash between the forces of the status quo, or the liberals, and the White House, and making it, perhaps the most chaotic political adventure in recent history. Every day you had new scandal that emerged. Every day you had people in the administration that were being fired. And remember the Muslim ban, the border wall, Charlottesville, and Trump's response to it were really all affront to liberal values and further reduced America's stock as a beacon of diversity, of tolerance, of progress. And then the pandemic broke out, which brought even more economic misery, and the friendly advice by Trump to inject bleach. Remember that? So the anti-Trump resistance, um, from during 2016 to 2020, really mobilized massively millions of people, foot soldiers, in the faction fight that was tearing apart the American ruling class between woke liberal Democrats and the president. And the liberals viewed Trump as a dire threat, really, to the kingdom, the empire that had been built for the last 2 decades and more, and they were not going to go down without a fight. So they didn't promise anything to workers and the oppressed uh, in the election, but began really to adopt the strategy to double down on liberal identity politics and present themselves as the biggest defenders of minorities. They started a whole campaign for, oh, immigrants at the border, and the families separated from their kids, even though they deported millions when they were in power as well. They BLM, they really threw themselves into BLM. They remember Nancy Pelosi taking the knee. They did everything that could rally enough people to kick out the supposed fascist Trump and reclaim the White House. And unable and unwilling to preside over deep changes in the economy and the in orientation in U.S. imperialism, the anti-Trump resistance and the liberal establishment really used the only tool that they had, which is liberalism and liberal identity politics. They launched a moral crusade over tokenistic measures, preaching liberal values even more aggressively as the material basis for providing real economic relief shrank further and further. That is why sometimes the Democrats went to extremes in terms of liberal politics, like promoting defund the police. Like some representative of the ruling class did promote that, and it was even implemented in certain cities, or advocating for gender affirming surgeries for migrants. So they went quite to extremes. Um, in lieu of offering actually real economic relief to seek to mobilize people behind their declining position against Trump, obviously. And what happened is that the liberal used fake concern over the oppressed to cover for the fact that conditions for the vast majority were only getting worse and worse, and that the ruling class, to salvage itself, was really squeezing the working class even harder. And what was happening is that the more the liberals were pushing for token measures for trans people, for women, for immigrants, for oppressed group, while at the same time the overall economic situation was deteriorating and getting harder, the more they eroded the effectiveness of their own methods. And the more they were preparing the ground for a backlash in the working class, not only against the liberals, but also against all the groups they were proclaiming to defend. And so, where was the left during this period, 2016 to 2020, the anti Trump resistance? So many workers who were fed up with their worsening economic situation went for Trump in 2016. In all these areas devastated by deindustrialization, all the millions and millions who were really fucked by globalization, a lot of them saw in Trump at least somebody who wanted to do something about it, who wanted to bring back manufacturing in the US, who wanting to that's really the appeal with Make America Great Again. And on the other hand, there were plenty of people, particularly black people or Latino, who stood by the Democrats out of fear of what Trump would bring, obviously legitimate uh, uh, fear. And this anger needed to be redirected, and those in the administration crosshair needed to be meaningfully defended. Obviously, there needed to be a fight against Trump. And the task of the left was to advance the struggle for better living standards in combination with a fight back against the attacks on minority. So, really, to bridge the defense of minority with the living conditions of the working class and the fight for better wage and conditions. And this requires the left to really engage in the various resistance movement, but as well as to expose and combat the bankruptcy of liberalism and point the way another way forward for workers in the oppressed, to make clear that any real improvements could be won only through a confrontation with the interests of the ruling class, be they the liberal wing or the not liberal wing, and which are all responsible for the oppression of the working class of minorities. And so, and that's what's really important to understand, the lessons of the anti-Trump resistance. Socialists and radicals had really to intervene in these movements, push the fight for women, push the fight for black liberation, push the fight for trans people, etc., but also wage the most relentless struggle against the liberals inside these movements and the chains that were restraining these movements, and split them along class lines. So in the women's movement, this effort needed to be directed against the middle class elements, the Me Too feminists, really at the head of these movements. In BLM, you had to really draw a hard line against anti-racist liberals, and liberal theory on race, which really expressed itself in the form of identity politics in the movement. The defense of immigrant could only proceed in opposition to liberal open border defenders of US hegemony. And so, in each of these cases, it was not sufficient just to go and support the movement while saying break with the Democrats. Because as long as these movements remain in the political framework of the Democratic Party, of this wing of the ruling class who wanted to maintain the liberal status quo, didn't really matter if you had a bunch of socialists saying break with the Democrats. The movement was firmly in their political framework. And so in each case, you had to further these struggles while fighting for a rupture with the liberals leading them, and fight to link these very struggle, immigrants, trans people, women, with the material interest of the working class. Now, obviously, this is not what happened. Instead, the left really echoed and embraced the liberal hysteria, which was really fueled by a wing of the ruling class, including by railing against Trump's base. This whole thing that, oh, the people who support Trump are white supremacists, these rednecks in these areas. This was really just liberal poison, which wrote off millions of white workers who voted for Trump, as if they were just white supremacists. And meanwhile, millions of them voted out of a rejection of the unbearable status quo. And liberals dismissed all their concerns they had for their worsening conditions. Oh, they're just white supremacists, backward, MAGA people. And the result was really to reinforce racial divisions. It drove millions of white workers in deeply into the arms of racist reaction, while at the same time, it pushed black people into the Democratic Party fold, because a lot of them were despairing at the prospect of winning white workers to the fight for black liberation. And the left also gave full throated support to every liberal movement, the women marches, sanctuary cities, BLM, all in the name of stopping Trump and the rise of fascism. And rather than waging a fight against the liberal politics of these movements and put the movement on a different track, a proletarian and anti-imperialist track, really, they really positioned themselves as the most radical wing of liberalism. So like most leftists also latched onto Sanders, AOC, the Squad, and really fueled illusions in these Democrats, whose role was really to provide a left cover for the liberal status quo and shackle anger to the Democratic Party. And all this activity was really a capitulation to the current, trying to keep the existing order afloat against Trump. Instead of charting an independent path for workers in the oppressed, most socialists chose a side in the imperialist faction fight, which was tearing the American ruling class apart, hitching themselves to the liberals. And ultimately, the left became associated with defense of the declining material conditions of the status quo, which had been screwing workers for years. And this could only push working people further to the right. And the consequence of the left capitulation can be seen in the current reactionary backlash against migrants. A backlash which was fueled, you had all the liberals banging about the right of minorities, together with a declining economic situation, which fueled the backlash not only against the liberals, but also against every oppressed group they claimed they were defending. And so this backlash really fueled by liberal moralizing, and joined by many liberals who then switched from calling for opening the border door under Trump to smashing it shut today. And it was a betrayal for anyone to call themselves a socialist during the anti-Trump resistant years, to have supported really any aspect of the liberal resistance movement. To meet workers' needs and defend minorities, liberalism as an idea must be rejected, as long as the movements are led by people who do not have a class struggle framework, but instead lead the movement on the basis of abstract liberal principles and values. It will continue to fuel deep and poisonous polarization. This is really the key lesson from the first Trump presidency and must really guide the struggles today. In 2020, the Democrats won back the White House with Joe Biden. But the Democratic Party left initially lined up behind Sanders, whose second bid for the Oval Office in 2020 was even more popular than the first. Things had gotten so bad under Trump that Sanders' populist rhetoric had renewed appeal among large layers of working people. And some bourgeois circles even started to be more open to providing a more social democratic cover to prop up US imperialism. In the end, though, the majority of the ruling class, and the working class for that matter, did not want a drastic change, but a return to normalcy, because that was really in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Trump here had been a political circus and seemed like something out of a drug-fueled fever dream. But more than anything, the pandemic really swung the pendulum back towards the politicians of the center and the status quo in the US, but also elsewhere. The ruling class was really in search of tested and reliable leaders to navigate the storm, and Biden rode the powerful wave of national unity to victory, temporarily putting the forces of right wing reaction on the defensive. Biden had promised an end to the pandemic, revived the economy, and rebuilds America's reputation. And Biden really embodied the return to the liberal, normal, quote unquote, road. We're going to defend democracy. We're going to bring back these great liberal values as the guides for our foreign policy. However, and all the liberals were like, "Oh, finally, we come back to normalcy." But little did they know that the Biden presidency would really be the kiss of death for the liberal world order. Once in office, the Democrats, like Trump, proceeded to, print money to compensate really for the economic disruption caused by the pandemic and the ruling class's response to it. And the short term stability this brought was soon offset by rampant inflation, which exploded, and the sharpening of social and political polarization, which had sort of, calmed a little bit in 2020, but then, came back to the fore even harder. And in the presidency's early days of Biden, he pledged to restore the country's infrastructure and manufacturing base and postured, as the most pro union president since FDR. Accordingly, he proposed measures, like Bidenomics, Build Back Better, the PRO Act, all these sorts of measures. And it was looking like the imperialist rulers had found the guy who maybe could bring things back to the way they were, stability and prosperity for US imperialism, until reality hit. The Biden agenda fell apart as the ground was being eroded from under his feet, militarily, economically, and politically. Instead of being able to confront China as was planned, Biden was drawn into one military crisis after another. So the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, for example, really symbolized the waning power of the US. And then the war in Ukraine erupted. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine was really the result of years after years of NATO expanding to East Europe, closer and closer and closer to Russia, and with Russia opposing this at every junction. And that was really the Putin's, drawing a line and getting to Ukraine was really the first direct challenge to the U.S. in recent history. And to the extent possible, the US marshaled a bunch of resources and forces as a show of strength, but failed really to stop Russia, revealing weakness instead. Now NATO and Ukraine are losing the war, with Russia, gaining grounds day after day, and it's been so for a while now. The U.S. ruling class has little interest in Ukraine, to be clear, except containing Russia and showing that they're strong. Antagonizing the Putin regime has cut into U.S. imperialism's ability to pursue more important objectives like confronting China. However, they're a bit stuck because to pull out from Ukraine now would show weakness and cut against the liberal values which the foreign policy was wrapped into. How could the US, the great defender of democracy against the autocracy and evil Putin, abandon Ukraine or even cut a deal with Putin? And this proxy war also has cost the US tens of billions of dollars. And when Ukraine and NATO inevitably lose, it will be a blow to US hegemony. And the war in Ukraine is also extremely popular in the United States. The American working people are sinking under inflation that, by the way, this war has helped stoke. Billions of dollars are being sent overseas to fund a war that the vast majority of Americans just don't care about, as they can't even afford groceries, many of them. But the Democratic administration tells them, oh yeah, everything is fine. We got to support Ukraine. The economy is doing better, and stop complaining. Which is obviously undermining support to any sort of their forever wars. So lofty liberals' ideas again smashed up against material reality, and this is even more true in the case of Palestine. For over 15 months now, the Democrats, the party which is supposed to represent the global enlightenment, have overseen the genocide in Gaza. Their support to Israel has been ironclad. Genocide be damned, because the Zionist state, Israel, is U.S. imperialism outpost in the Middle East. And it's also harder to preach democracy and defense of the defenseless when one is providing the bombs, 2,000-pound bombs being dropped on Palestinian children and women, and destroying the entire Gaza Strip. And this contradiction sparked a protest movement of outraged youth, out of anger at such things. However, the movement still was stuck in a liberal framework, because rather than being directed at imperialism, the basis of the movement was chained to really liberal ideas and really seeking to make U.S. policy align with the supposed values that they're supposed to defend. And as a result, there was tremendous repression on the encampments. Many were demoralized, and others are looking for answers, as to why the movement went into a dead end. And we've written extensively on lessons to be drawn. I don't have time to get into it, but really the point is that the first step really to advance the movement is to break with the liberal politics which have been holding back the struggle. Biden's 4 year proved to be a catastrophe for working people and accelerated the bleeding out of US hegemony. After he was forced to drop out of the presidential race by his party because, frankly, he was completely senile, Kamala Harris entered the fray. And remember, there was so much enthusiasm for Kamala Harris, and all the rappers and celebrity coming to the Democratic convention, and everybody, yay! But obviously, she was the last dying hope of the liberal status quo, the sort of last breath that a dying, corpse is making. And she was completely obliterated in the presidential election. And so this time around is not the same as 2016. That's really important to understand for leftists. Back then in 2015, in 16, Trump's victory was seen as a fluke, as something abnormal, and the resistance really coalesced to bring normalcy. The Democrats fought back with everything they had, doubling down on the liberal ideas and order they had built. But now they are completely defeated, and they are busy tossing one liberal value after another, completely abandoning the groups they claim to champion, walking away from globalization's economic foundations, free trade and open borders, and really lining up to kiss the ring. And the more the Democrats doubled down on liberalism as it was reaching its material and ideological limits, the stronger the force hostile to it became. And the ruling class is now consolidating around a radical shift in strategy to advance its interests, led by Trump. The conditions that made liberalism its dominant ideology are gone and are not coming back in the foreseeable future. So the liberal mask is now slipping off and really revealing the snarling teeth that have been hiding underneath all along. And so another development is that following the pandemic, particularly, the working class, battered by inflations and many years of attacks and concessions to the bosses, has grown increasingly restive and willing to engage in class battles, as we've seen with the multiplication of strikes and quite important confrontations of labor against capital. However, thus far, this combativity has been paired not with a leadership capable of turning the tide in favor of workers and winning their demands, but rather with trade union leaders seeking palliatives within the confines of the liberal status quo. And the problem is that the conditions of the working class cannot be qualitatively improved while respecting the objectives of the US ruling class to dominate the world. And that's the issue with the leaders of the unions in the US. So pro-capitalist union leaders like the militant talking UAW head Sean Fain have really undercut strikes through their refusal really to put the government in a crisis during the UAW strikes. And Sean Fain really has been playing the role as the main conduit for uh, liberal ideas and pro democratic party politics inside the workers' movement. Really boasting of his role in the 2023 auto strike, Sean Fain became a prominent hustler for Biden and Kamala Harris' campaign, calling Trump a scab and Kamala Harris one of us. Even so, most of the socialist left treats Sean Fain as if he was, above the rest of the trade union bureaucracy in the United States, while he is simply its most outspoken advocate for the Democratic Party, for liberal ideas. And far from fighting right now for a new class struggle strategy counterposed to that of the current labor bureaucrats, most socialists are just cheerleading on Sean Fain or pressure him to go a little further down the road on which he is now, which can only spell disaster for workers' struggle in the future and the socialist cause. And the working class has reacted to Trump's reelection with a bit of a shrug mix or a sense of dread at the direction the US is heading. Many workers believe that their life will get better under Trump. However, there are also many who are worried and scared about what Trump has in store. And notably, there is a greater number of black people and Latinos who voted for Trump this time than previously. And these voters, although personally repulsed probably, by the Republican nominee, have had their fill of moral, browbeating, broken promises, and economic pain at the hands of the liberals. Remember the famous video of Obama, lecturing young black people for not, coming out as they did under him for Kamala Harris. And under their hammer blows, the working class has shifted to the right. That's what's happening right now in the US. Liberals have fed right wing reaction by, among other things, driving a wedge between the working class and oppressed groups. The liberals preach tolerance while pitting different sectors of the oppressed against one another in a scramble over an ever shrinking pool of resources. The combination this combination only breeds resentment and divisions. So for example, in democratic run cities, migrants are forced into black and brown poor communities where they are considered competitions for the little crumbs on offers. A lot of workers, and not only white workers, but also brown and black workers, see that migrants receive some measly state service while they can barely make ends meet. And if they say anything about their situation, the liberals label these people as racist and bigots, and which obviously creates a backlash against immigrants. Ever conciliatory to liberalism, those claiming to be socialists have not proposed any real challenge to this divide and rule strategy, which is happening everywhere in America. That is the independent working class movement needed to resolve the migrant crisis in a progressive manner by lifting both the migrant but also regular working people who receive only crumbs. And thus, the role of the socialist left has really been to help served up working people to the right, when the most socialists, their role is to label racist anybody questioning the immigration policy, anybody being concerned a little bit that their devastated community receive more immigrants, and rather than offering a class struggle road to say, look, the problem is not the immigrant, the problem is the rulers, and laying a path to struggle, most liberals and even socialists will just denounce them as racist. So that is this backlash that is being fueled. And now the reality today is that the vast majority of people in the U.S. support Trump's massive deportation plan, and not just white people, honestly. Now we'll get into um, Trump 2.0, the tariffs, the deportation plan, and the reaction of the left. But I will leave this part for part two, which is coming up. Stay tuned. Leave some comments if you agree, disagree, if you like it or not. Like and subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for part two of Where is the US Going?